I would like to welcome Dr. Jeff Scher to this interaction, and thank you very much, Jeff, for joining us and for um, taking time to be with us.
It's an honor to be here. Glad to be with you.
Great. So one thing that we are going to talk to you about, obviously, although you have varying interests across media literacy and then some, my interest in this interaction arises from your work in critical media literacy, like I said, and back from 2007, you've been writing about it, and you've been kind of campaigning for the need for education to include critical media literacy. So why don't we start by understanding what media literacy really, or critical media literacy is really, because media literacy is about critical thinking. But what is critical media literacy, and therefore, why should the student of media literacy care?
Okay, great questions. So for me, critical media literacy is about doing two things, basically. It's taking the concept of literacy that we've been thinking about for 500 years, since the printing press was invented. And for most of that time, we've thought about literacy as being just the ability to read and write letters on a page. And I think what we need to do now, especially with living in the digital age, is recognize the literacy needs that people have in today's world are much different than what they were back when the Gutenberg printing press was, putting out their first Bibles. So today, what I stress with the idea of critical media literacy are these two ideas. One, it's about a broadening of our understanding of literacy to recognize that what we're talking about when we're talking about reading and writing is much more than just print. So we're talking about reading and writing photographs, images, sounds, music, songs, movies, advertising, popular culture, all the different ways we communicate. When we're talking about teaching students to read and write literacy, we need to be including all these different forms, different mediums of communication. So that's one part, this expansive notion of literacy. And that's something that most people in the media literacy movement agree with. The place where we kind of diverge a bit is the critical component. The critical component is what I feel is the need to deepen our understanding of the way information and power are always connected. And so that second part of critical media literacy is going deep into the questioning, the inquiry about how is power being supported or framed or limited, and how are we being positioned, either benefiting or being hurt by these different messages. And so it's those two ideas, expanding and then deepening the question about power.
But what is the power? So what do we actually mean by this this kind of dominating force, or I guess in critical literature we might call it dominant ideology? And does the power relation necessarily interfere with or conflict with social justice, or we might call it communicative justice if we want to equate communication as so central to our lives these days. Relatedly, I guess, is there a problem with the way that the media are representing us, or represent per se? So, I mean, is there a connection? Am I connecting those dots right?
So you've raised a lot of different questions.
Sorry about that.
I'll try to take one at a time.
Sure.
The question you had about power and social justice, to me, social justice is all about power. I mean, social justice is about questioning inequality. It's about questioning when is power being abused and when is somebody being hurt because somebody else has power over them. So bringing in the question of power and ideology is essential for work in social or environmental justice. So to me, any type of critical work, any type of justice work is always connected to questioning power. Perhaps if you could ask that next one, but just one
So
question at a time.
sure. I was going to go with what is the problem, and especially when you connect that power to the media or the media systems, how is that power exercised?
Okay, great. So if you think about us as humans, as a species, we've been on the planet for tens of thousands of years. And the majority of our time, we did not have the technology, the tools that we have today. For most of that time, we were oral cultures. Our literacy was an oral literacy. It wasn't print. And so it's really very recent in human history that we've been so focused on print, and even more recent that we've been focused so much on digital and virtual and these other areas of internet and social media and all these new technologies. Historically, we've been dependent on storytellers. Humans are storytellers. And most of the time, our storytellers were individuals, typically people we respected, the elders in the community, people who showed and demonstrated an expertise in something. And we went to them and we listened to them because we depended on them to pass on that information, that knowledge, that culture. Without them, we wouldn't be here today. And so I think recognizing just how connected we are to storytelling and stories is a really key part. So if we kind of fast forward through that human history to our current time, we recognize that what's happening now, because of this media sphere, this information age we live in, our main storytellers today are not those people, those elders who their priority was to protect and promote the goals of the society, of that community, of that those people who depend on them, right? Those were the kind of the sages that we could look to in the past. Mm. Today, our dominant storytellers are not. Our dominant storytellers, for the most part, whether it's entertainment, information, sports, all the different areas where information is being communicated, the main organizing force of all of those is business. It's built on a capitalistic model of profit. And when the primary motive is profit, society is going to come second. And at times that can be very detrimental to democracy, to human well-being, to health. I mean, we've seen just the viral disinformation about the pandemic and how many people lost their lives because of that disinformation. So we live in an age right now where we need to be far more proactive and far more critical about the information that we are using and sharing and creating ourselves.
Sure. But do you think that the media organizations themselves recognize this, and therefore, when they claim to represent us, which I think is how we understand the media, that in some way or the other they represent us. Is there a problem with that representation today, despite their own understanding that there are power systems and we need to kind of connect with the people?
So most media organizations in the United States specifically are commercial, and they're based on a design and an understanding that profit must come first. And whether you're at the New York Times or whether you're at Fox News, the journalists understand that. They all work for business. They all get their paychecks, and they know if they go against that business, they're not going to get that paycheck anymore.
Right.
So everybody, all journalists and all media makers that work for commercial media enterprises. I mean, there are other types. They're independent, they're governmental, and there are others that have different biases. But the majority are commercial, and the majority are designed strategically to make the most profit. And that's one of the reasons that Amazon, Google, Facebook, Meta, are the wealthiest corporations in the world today. They're making tremendous profits. And even something like Google, the search engine, a lot of people think, well, it's just free. It's just, a service. Mm-hmm. It's not. It's an extremely wealthy company that's built on a profit model that basically makes money through advertising and strategically through this idea that Shoshana Zuboff talks about, surveillance capitalism, by collecting your data. Every word, everything you put into a Google search is saved and captured, and then it's used and it's sold to be able to profile you for advertisers, to be able to then predict your behavior and then nudge and shape what you do and make profit from you.
Right. So therefore, in some ways, we are the digital labor. We are actually doing labor for corporations' profits in that sense.
Absolutely.
And there is this feeling that we are gaining the most from it because of all the goodies that we see there. But that said, has anything changed in the sense that today we are supposedly media prosumers? We're at once consumers of media texts as well as we relay media texts, but we also produce media texts. We can post on social media our opinions and so on and so forth. But so this is claimed to be a form of democratization. Therefore, with democratization, there needs to be a distribution of power. Do you think that's happened?
So there's a huge inequality here. And the concept of prosumers kind of assumes that there is this equality. And the reality is, I mean, we all, I think, know it deep down that if I post a tweet today, it's not going to get the traction, the echo. It's not going to go out like if Tucker Carlson posts that same tweet, or, different people, the Kardashians, they're different amounts of power that exist and definitely determine who I'll be able to reach and the impact of my messages. So even though we do have an ability to type something into Twitter, into Facebook, into the internet, where it's going to go and the impact it's going to have is not equal.
You talked upfront, you used the word technology, and therefore a lot of people are blaming the technology. Are they accurate, or are algorithms to blame? Are they autonomous by themselves?
Well, I think there are a couple pieces to it. I mean, this is not simple stuff. It's complex, and It's important to kind of take it apart. Technology on its own is just a tool, right? It's a tool that can be used for different things, but the design of the technology oftentimes shapes the way it'll be used. A gun is designed not to build a house. A gun is designed to do something that's going to cause violence, going to create a problem or a solution, depending on how it's used, right?
Sure.
But these tools that are being designed today, and especially if we look at social media, are being designed like slot machines. They're being designed for the intended purpose of keeping your attention. It's the attention economy. And so in a way, the technology is part of the problem, but it's not to blame the technology. It's not enough just to simply say, don't use social media. But what we need to do is recognize the people who are designing these, the creators of these, are designing them with strategic ideas that are not putting society first. And this is where the tools are being used to limit democracy in many ways, and at times even contribute to genocides and contribute to all sorts of different problems based mainly on the way it's designed. Even if it's not intended that way, these designs still have effects that matter.
So in that sense, communication, therefore, is not just a tool. Therefore, as a technology, the technology is not merely a tool. It can be a weapon, depending on how it's used. And if you think about it, therefore, language, which is the tool of communication, is also the weapon. For example, genocide is a great example. You just mentioned it. What happened in Rwanda. Apparently, the next country is going to be India, where genocide might take place. Oh yeah, the Genocide Watch people are saying that Muslims are probably going to be targeted. But in that sense, therefore, that there is nothing like autonomous technology. It is basically controlled of who controls the narrative, and therefore, I guess that's where the communications come. In fact, something you said in your book is the myth of objectivity. That struck me as important, especially from the point of view of language. Lakoff and Johnson say the same thing. I mean, they say objectivism, which objectivity is derived, is basically a myth, right? Like, so both in critical media literacy terms, though, not necessarily just in the practice of journalism or the production of media text, but as the prosumer, how should I look at this myth, and how should I learn? What should I learn from this myth?
So with the work I do in critical media literacy, we use some conceptual understanding, some basic ideas that have come and evolved from cultural studies, from a lot of brilliant philosophers, thinkers, theorists. And one of the big umbrella ideas is the notion of the social constructivism, that all information is constructed, is created by human beings, that media is not neutral, education is not neutral. And so if we start from there, we have to reject the myth that information is objective or can even be objective.
Mm-hmm.
And moving beyond that to recognize, well, there's always going to be bias. There's always going to be different subjectivity. So simply looking for objective information should not be our goal, because it's a false target. It doesn't exist, and it gets people to go down the wrong path. And a lot of what's happening, I see now with fake news, is people are just trying to say, well, it's fake or it's true. If it's true,
right,
I don't have to question it.
Right.
And that's really problematic, because yes, there are things that are purposefully false and manipulative. But just if something wasn't fake, just because a picture
right.
was not manipulated in Photoshop, doesn't mean we don't need to be asking, well, how did they frame it? What's not in the frame? Why is it's so dark? All of these other aspects that are influencing the reader about how to think when they're looking at that picture. And it's not fake news, it's real. But at the same time, it's biased. It has all these different qualities that we need to be questioning as more skeptical citizens, so that we can then make better judgments. And,
right.
There was a classic example of these two covers when Time and Newsweek both published a cover of O.J. Simpson at the time, right? During, I think it was right before the trial started. And one picture, they're both mugshot pictures. So they're basically very kind of sterile, objective looking photographs. But Time magazine darkened the picture, or actually, you know what? I don't remember, it was Time. One of them darkened it, the other didn't. And when you put the two covers together, it's obvious just how manipulative it is. But even the picture that wasn't darkened still is a manipulation. What angle was it shot from? What lens was used? What type of film was used? Back then we used film. It's all of those things still will influence the way you think or feel when you're looking at a piece of media.
Right. So fake news takes on different forms, and doesn't have to be only false information. It could be a manipulation of many things, and not just the words you're saying.
Well, I mean, part of the problem with the term fake news is it's a term that's been, like you were saying, weaponized. Trump used fake news to describe anything that he didn't like, didn't agree with. Some people just use fake news to talk about a picture that's been manipulated in Photoshop. It's a slippery slope with any terminology. But I think the bigger idea is getting at the understanding that all media have bias. All media are constructed by humans who make decisions. And those decisions they make are always going to influence the message. Right now, when you're looking at me with this background behind me, I chose this photograph because I wanted to give an impression for the viewer of, something positive, something pretty in nature, a connection with the natural world. But that's, some people could say, well, that's a manipulation. Well, yeah, I mean, all information is subjective, whether you actually think of it and plan it or not. It's still always going to have some type of impact on the viewer.
That, I think, actually is an important point to make, because both ideology and power seem inevitable, and yet the solution seems to lie, just deriving from what you're saying, with this prosumer who must then detect that, but live with it, and not necessarily be in a position to repair that production, but be in a position to consume it, I guess, responsibly or right. Is that fair to say?
Well, I don't kind of align myself with the idea of right or correct. I do like the idea of responsible. I think we all need to be responsible citizens globally. We all need to be thinking about other people, about our planet, about
Right.
All the other things as well, not just ourselves. So I think that's an important question when we're looking at information, is asking, well, who's being hurt by this? Who's benefiting from it? And that's one of the questions we have when we're providing our kind of.
And those two questions go together, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because typically, if one person's benefiting from it, there's going to be someone else who's being harmed by it, not necessarily equally. But, the whole notion of privilege means somebody's getting something that somebody else isn't.
Right.
And so, starting to just ask those questions, because oftentimes what happens when we're in the privileged position where we're benefiting from something, we often don't see the negative implications. So like men don't really understand, don't see patriarchy because they're benefiting from it so often, where women who have to deal with the negative impacts of patriarchy are more likely to see those structures and those ideologies.
Right. So a student of media literacy is more likely to be privileged in the sense of being able, therefore, to detect ideology and power. Do you think, therefore, that puts a great deal of responsibility on the student of media literacy to be then create or spread that kind of awareness?
That's a tough one. I don't think someone really is, quote, media literate. It's not something you become. It's a process. I mean, all the time I'm looking at media and things, and there are times I'm being fooled, I'm misreading, I'm not understanding things. It's an ongoing process that we're always should be, as much as possible, actively engaged in questioning and investigating. But there's so much out there all the time that we're not all, getting it right. And sometimes, we're just sitting back on the couch and we're just soaking it in. But I do think there's an advantage for people who practice and try to be more critical and more aware, who use some of the tools of critical media literacy, that they're more likely to be able to see the systems and the structures at play. Because there are a lot of people, who promote conspiracy theories, who think they are the most critical people in the world, and that's part of their whole discourse. But the intent with critical media literacy is to be asking questions that are going to challenge and question issues of power, to be able to kind of move beyond those conspiracy notions that typically are hegemonic and reproduce the dominant structures, to be able to ask, like, how is the effect of that? Regardless of what you think of why it might have happened, because sometimes it doesn't matter why something happens. What matters most is what happened, is that effect. These people are starving, these people are dying, regardless of what the motive was. They're dead. And so looking at those effects and the impact of media is a really important part to then start questioning, how did this happen? What was involved? How, the questions that can give us a better understanding of the structures that led to the problems.
The key thing there is the question. Obviously, a conspiracy theory by definition is a statement and not a question, and that right there is probably the problem. Jeff, I wanted to shift gears to your experience, because media literacy might have come to you serendipitously, I don't know, but you've been a journalist for a long, photojournalist for a long time. You've been taking pretty pictures like the one behind you, and yet some of those pictures are not pretty because they represent anguish, poverty, that kind of stuff. Did that, you think, make you more literate?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. No, my 10 years I spent as a photojournalist is where I learned about, the techniques of photography and the ways journalism communicates. And we all do. People working in journalism, right. We know our crafts. We're experts. We're professionals, right? So for an example, there was an assignment one day when we had the Olympics in Los Angeles, the Summer Olympics, and the editor for the newspaper sent me down to Westwood, the area where the athletes were, because we were noticing there were very few people there. It wasn't crowded at all. And my assignment was to get a photograph, to come back with a photograph that they could put on the front page of the newspaper that would demonstrate this idea, would visually illustrate the emptiness of this area during the Olympics. So I used all the skills I had as a photojournalist to create that picture. I used a wide camera angle because I knew a wide lens is going to give you this sense of space. I found a high vista point because I knew looking down, kind of bird's eye view, is also going to give this kind of vastness. And then when I went to take the picture, I waited. I waited until there was no one walking through the area. There were no cars driving, because I also knew that the less that's in that picture at that moment, and there will be a moment because things are moving, at that right moment is when the picture is going to look the emptiest. And so in a way, I was being very manipulative, but at the same time, I was there on the scene. I knew it was empty, and I wanted to communicate that visually to someone else who's just going to take a couple of seconds to look at the picture. And if they don't see any people in it, they see a wide, high view of this with nobody in there, they're going to walk away going, wow, it's really dead. It's empty up there.
Right.
So,
right.
Is that manipulative?
Yeah. So you're saying that manipulation is not necessarily a bad word. It's just in the interpretation of how manipulation happens, for what purpose, and whether you're actually trying to appropriate power or you're trying to distribute the power. For example, the wide angle that you were talking about creates that the sense that you want to create because of what that is. What, for example, an event is. I mean, its very purpose or its very definition would be something, and then therefore you can't miss it. But a manipulation might be to do the opposite, for example, right?
Sure, it could be used anyway. So
right.
Manipulation is another one of those words that typically has a negative connotation. There can be bad manipulations, and a lot of times when we use the word manipulation, we use it with the idea that you're tricking someone, you're manipulating
right.
them to do something they wouldn't do or think, right? So what I did doesn't need to be called a manipulation, could just
right.
be called photographic
right.
Techniques
yes.
of visual communication. That's what we do. You have to choose your lens.
Right.
Anytime you take a picture, you have to make these choices. When do I push the button? And so it's not necessarily a manipulation,
sure.
but it can be a manipulation, especially when you try to be dishonest with
right.
what you know is going
right.
on.
Right. So the framing is a form of manipulation. However, it depends on what you're trying to do with it. Are you then challenged by the selfie takers and the people who have joined professional photojournalists as almost a competition, or at least an addition to, I don't know, magazines, online newspapers, and so on and so forth? Does that challenge this notion that you're saying?
No, I think the challenge is for them. I mean, because what's happening now is everybody's a photographer, basically. I mean, everybody who has a cell phone that's got a camera in it at some point is going to use it. And a lot of people, a lot of students, my students come into my class at 10 a.m. and they've already been taking pictures, whether it's selfies or whatever it is. So it's happening more and more. What's really important for me is that we all think more critically about it and recognize that every time we pick up a camera, that frame that we're using is choosing what to see, and everything that's on the outside is not being chosen, right? And so that, in a way, is communicating to the viewer only what you want them to see, the way you want them to see it. And in some sense, I think kids are becoming more visually literate because they're taking the pictures, because a lot of times we learn just through the process of doing it and creating. So that's a really important part of critical media literacy, is that people are creating media as well. Like you're using the term prosumer, pro being producer. So I think there is a possibility for people to become much more critical thinkers. However, it's not happening. That critical thought is often not moving into the area of questioning that myth of objectivity, questioning ideology. So often when people are doing this, they're reproducing the same representations and stereotypes that they grew up with.
A form of mimicking, or a form of newly acquired power and authority, probably, of being able to tell a story.
I think more than kind of something that's done on purpose, I think a lot of people don't recognize, don't question ideology. They don't know about how there are these dominant ideas that are being reproduced over and over, because it happens so often they become what Stuart Hall calls normalized. They seem like they're normal. And so when something seems like it's normal, you don't question it and you reproduce it. So that's why so oftentimes, the idea of the tough macho man is reproduced often, where that's a construction. That's something that, is part of this patriarchal ideology that, puts this notion that there are only two genders and that one gender is male and it's tough and violent, and the other gender is female and it's soft and a caretaker and needs to be protected. I mean, those are all kind of the dominant ideological stereotypes that so many people around the world have internalized and reproduced without even recognizing that it's a social construction.
So is it fair to say that one advice you would have for younger folks or folks who might be just getting into this media production, at whatever, just using a smartphone, for example, would be that just iterations and just being out there and doing it and just practice, along with the understanding, a growing understanding of what they're doing, and repetition in a critical way is the way to go?
For me, it's about questions. Like you said in the beginning, it's about an inquiry process. The more we can be asking critical questions, the more likely we're going to be learning what's really going on, and we're going to be less likely to be reproducing the problems.
To end, Jeff, I want to ask you about your current projects or current ongoing research. What's going on with media literacy in your own space? I know that you were a champion also of eco-media literacy. I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Sure. So that's the latest thing that I've been very fascinated with. I started by reading some of the work by Antonio Lopez, who's been doing amazing writing and research on what he has coined eco-media literacy. And it's the idea of looking at our relationship with the natural world and how is that being reproduced and represented through all the different forms of media that we engage with. And so to me, this is probably the most important thing that we need to be looking at today because of the climate crisis. We're living in a time where there are just a few years left before we can really change the fate of our planet. And it's essential that we become aware, we become critical of the messages and of the things that we're doing as a society, our governments, our corporations, because there's still time to change. And at the same time, unfortunately, there's some extremely wealthy corporations and a few individuals who are pouring billions of dollars into disinformation. The fossil fuel industry knows they're going to lose a lot of money because we have to stop using petroleum. We can't keep burning fossil fuels like we're doing, because that's just going to push us closer and closer into extinction.
Right.
And so they're looking very short-sightedly at their own profits without a long range understanding that this is going to affect their future generations. And they're contributing to the problem right now very strategically, creating what Naomi Oreskes talks about. They've been manufacturing doubt. They don't have to prove to anyone it's not real. All they have to do is get people to just doubt. Because if you doubt it and say, gosh, I'm not really sure that CO2 is causing this problem, if you just have that doubt, you're not likely to support dramatic change that needs to happen. We need to stop using all fossil fuels. And that's a huge shift. It's going to make life very different for everybody around the world. But it's not a question. It's a matter of time, and we will eventually. But it was probably going to, if we wait too long, it will be too late.
Right.
So these companies are really putting us in great jeopardy, and especially making it worse for the poorest and most marginalized parts of the world, because those are the ones that are going to suffer. That already these island nations, poor developing countries, don't have the facilities and the wherewithal to be able to just simply turn on the air conditioner or find a way around it. And we're going to see tremendous problems. We're going to see climate refugees skyrocketing. I mean, there's going to be so much. And in some ways, I think there are people on the alt-right who know this, and that's kind of Trump's idea about build the wall. It's like they believe they can kind of create this life raft, this area protecting themselves from everyone else as if it won't touch them. Eventually it will. But the problem is, on that way, it's going to be hurting so many people. And it's a huge issue for me of social justice.
Right. I think one thing to take away from your passion for ecology and climate change and so forth is that media literacy has so many connections and so many, therefore, many implications, and thereby also subjects for study. And as it gets probably more specialized, I mean, we would all like to see it more specialized. And probably that's the future. That's my big takeaway from your application of that, how you connect the dots between ecology and how the media are either exacerbating it or by trying to be objective and somehow bringing in the 1% and the 99% on the same table and discussing it as if it's a debatable topic. I think they're doing a disservice to something that's probably a fact. But Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time again. This has been a wonderful pleasure to hear you, and hopefully we'll do this again.
I would love to. One thing before we go, I'd just like to share this one website, because I think there are a lot of really wonderful resources here. So I'll just share screen very quickly and I'll show you. This is, whoops, let me get rid of this. This is a website that we update regularly at UCLA that's got lots of articles, videos, podcasts, different resources for teaching and learning about critical media literacy. And on the left, you can see there's a tab, an index for you to be able to look at different areas, whether it's climate change or sexism, racism, photography,
Right.
All these different areas with just a wonderful collection of resources.
Repository.
Yeah.
And I see on the right that you're doing an event, is it? Or a series, was it, on critical media literacy?
Sure. There's a conference coming up. It's a Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. And it's free for anybody interested. And it's both in person in Oakland, California, and parts of it will also be online. So if you're interested, check out the Critical Media Literacy Conference of the Americas. You can register online.
Well, on that note, again, Jeff, thank you very much for taking the time, and everybody, have a good day.